Chapter 4, The Visit, page 38. Miss Mowbray was writing on the board. She was talking as she wrote, but Danny couldn't hear her words. His heart was pounding so hard in his ears that he couldn't hear anything. It was like having his head under an invisible waterfall, a waterfall as loud as that one up near Saranac Lake where his father had taken him last summer. He looked up at the clock. Wasn't it ever going to be 2 p.m.? Danny shook his head and tried to focus on what Miss Mowbray was doing. He watched her hands move. They fluttered like birds as she wrote with the chalk and gestured. Then the buzzer on the intercom sounded. Danny heard that. He almost jumped up to answer it himself. Miss Mowbray walked over to the intercom. He had never known she could walk so slowly. She pressed the button, and Danny saw her lips shape the words. "Yes, what is it?" As soon as she spoke those words, the invisible waterfall stopped flowing over his head. Danny could hear again. The usual garble of sounds that no one but teachers could understand came out of the intercom grill. Miss Mowbray nodded. She looked over at Danny with a smile and nodded again. "We have a special afternoon guest," she said to the class. "You can put your math away. We'll have our quiz tomorrow." 24 heads looked up with relief. "Yes," Danny whispered to himself. "Perfect timing, Dad." 2 people will have to go to the office to escort our guests to the classroom. Miss Mowbray looked around the classroom at the raised turn the page, page 40. Hands of volunteers sprouting up like small trees. Danny waited for her to call his name. "Consuela and Tyrone." Tyrone raised one eyebrow and then lowered it as his name was called. The other kids in the class laughed. Tyrone could always make them laugh. He raised his arms in triumph and started down the aisle. As he brushed by Danny's desk, Danny put his arms over his books. Maybe it had been an accident, but that morning as he walked by Danny's desk, Tyrone had knocked everything onto the floor with his elbow. Consuela's desk was on the other side of the classroom. As she walked across toward the door, she did a pirouette. Another ripple of laughter ran through the classroom, and Miss Mowbray joined in. Everybody knew Consuela was a dancer. That made her popular. She was nice to people too. Danny had to admit that. He was glad that Consuela was going to escort his father to the classroom, but Tyrone, that could be a disaster. What if Tyrone made fun of his father? The classroom door closed and Miss Mowbray was talking again. "We haven't begun our unit on Native Nations yet, so before our guest comes, let me tell you a few things about the Iroquois." Miss Mowbray wrote Iroquois on the board. Then she told the class how the Iroquois call themselves the people of the Longhouse. They were a confederacy of Native nations living in the area we now call New York State, she said. They were good farmers and hunters and great warriors when they defended their homes and their families. Danny knew all of that, but he smiled at what Miss Mowbray said next. "The Iroquois lived in long buildings called longhouses, not teepees," she said. Then she looked straight at Danny. "Because I want you all to know that Native American people are not just part of the past. I've invited our special guest to come to class today. He's the father of one of our students. And here he is now." Danny looked toward the door. Lately, he had been looking at the door 100 times every day. He would look at it worrying about what would happen when he went through it to go to gym. Just yesterday, as he reached the door, someone had pushed him from, turn the page, page 42, behind, and he'd hit his elbow so hard on the door jamb that he had to struggle to hold back the tears. He would stare at the doorway, thinking about how he'd be able to get through without bumping into Tyrone or Brad on his way to lunch. He had been looking at it, waiting for the final bell so he could go through the door and go home. This time, though, his father was standing in that dangerous doorway. It was so strange to see his father there with Consuela and Tyrone that Danny almost laughed, but he didn't. Consuela was smiling and looking up at Danny's father. Danny knew that his father had probably said something funny. She was carrying the big leather bag that Danny's father always kept behind his chair in their living room. Tyrone was carrying something too. It was Richard Bigtree's hard hat. As Danny watched, Tyrone put the hard hat down carefully on the little table Miss Morbury had placed at the front of the room. Consuela and Tyrone, thank you. You may sit down now, Miss Morbury said. Class, this is Mr. Richard Bigtree, Daniel's father. He is a member of the Mohawk Nation, one of the 5 nations that make up the Iroquois Confederacy. Richard Bigtree flashed a smile at his son and then looked out around the class as he took something out of his bag. Who knows what this is? Danny knew what it was, a wampum belt. His father had made it, copying the design of the ancient Hiawatha belt. On the belt, in purple and white beads, were the shapes of a tall tree and 4 squares, symbols of the founding of the Great League of Peace. Is it a headband? Someone said from the back of the room. Danny's father shook his head. Is it a belt? Consuela said. That's good, said Danny's father, but what kind of belt is it? A boy named Kofi raised his hand on the other side of the room. Danny's father nodded to him. I know, Kofi said. It's a wampum belt. I saw one at the museum last week. Turn the page, page 44. That's right, Danny's father said. It's a wampum belt. To us, it is like a book because it tells a story. Would you like to hear that story? Yes, everyone said. And Danny listened again as his father told the story of the coming of peace, the story of Hiawatha. Danny's father finished his story and looked at the classroom. No one moved or said a word. He smiled. Has anyone ever seen that pine tree anywhere? No one answered him. Then he held up his hard hat, and some of the kids laughed. It's on your hat, said a boy in the front row. Danny was surprised. The boy, whose name was Tim, was never the first to answer any question. Tim looked back at Danny and grinned. Richard Bigtree nodded his head. One of the first flags that the United States used had a pine tree on it. The founders of this country, Benjamin Franklin in particular, knew about the Iroquois League. Old Ben Franklin said that the colonists ought to band together like the Iroquois nations did. A lot of people who, turn the page 46, study how governments are made now think that the United States Constitution is partially modeled after the Iroquois. Any of you got a quarter? Everyone in the class began searching their pockets. Danny, though, had been waiting for this moment. He had the quarter ready in his hand. Here, Dad, Danny said, tossing the quarter to him. Richard Bigtree reached out one big hand and caught the quarter without even looking at it. He held it up. You see what's on one side of this? It's an eagle, just like the one on my hat. Just like the one on top of that big pine tree. What's it holding? Brad raised his hand. I know, he said. It's holding 13 arrows. They stand for the 13 colonies. Just like our Iroquois eagle that holds 5 arrows standing for the 5 Iroquois nations. Awesome, Brad said. Tyrone had had his hand up now. Richard Bigtree nodded to him. What happened to Adadoranahodude? Tyrone said. Any ideas? Richard Bigtree said. Maybe they put him on trial and then sent him on to the electric chair, said Tyrone. The class laughed. Richard Bigtree laughed too, but he shook his head. No, that's not what they did. Did they banish him? Consuela said. No, Mr. Bigtree explained what he had told Danny about how a bad human being could be made into a good one. If you believe in peace, then an enemy can become a friend, he said. Tyrone started to raise his hand again, but just then the bell rang. Miss Morbury stood and held her hands up, palms towards the class. Everyone, she said, tomorrow is Friday and we will have that test then, so be prepared. Now before we leave, let's give Mr. Bigtree a round of applause to thank him for taking the time to share his wonderful story. The class exploded into applause, and Danny's father smiled back at them. He looked at Danny and winked. Danny winked back. It was great that his father had come to school, but would the kids treat him better now?